Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the former deputy leader of Somali extremist group Al-Shabaab defects. One-time spokesman Mukhtar Robow is now calling for others to follow his lead. Also, the death toll from Sierra Leone's fatal mudslides rises to over 400. Sunday night's disaster devastated Freetown. Meanwhile, the difficult search for survivors continues. And it's the biggest church in the world, but Ivory Coast's Basilica of Our Lady of Peace seldom draws the crowds it's capable of holding. We take a peek at the congregation at the Festival of Assumption. First up, the former deputy leader of Somali extremist group Al-Shabaab has defected to the government. Until this official renouncing of the insurgency, one-time spokesman Mukhtar Robow had been lying low. He fell out with Al-Shabaab in 2013. He's now calling for others to follow his lead.
I left Al-Shabaab 5 years and 7 months ago. I urged the militants to leave Al-Shabaab. I left them because of misunderstanding, and I disagreed with their creed, which does not serve Islam, people, and the country. I also thank the government and its international friends who played a role in the matter up to this point.
Well, until earlier this year, Robow had been on the US's list of sponsors of terrorism with a $5 million reward for his capture. Shababs carried out deadly attacks across the region, including Kenya. Matt Bryden tells us more about what his defection may say about the coherence of the group's inner circle.
There were ideological differences back in 2013, including relations with Al-Qaeda proper, including the treatment of foreign fighters and the scope of Al-Shabaab's jihad, whether it was international or whether it was simply a Somali jihad. And those led to a purge in which Robow's wing, or other leaders of Robow's wing, were assassinated or tried and executed, and Robow fled. So there was an ideological split, but that has not really been an issue in the last few years. This is a historical issue, not a current one.
So what's likely to happen to him now?
Well, Robow has suggested, according to people close to the negotiations, that he would like to lead his militia back into a fight with Al-Shabaab and is looking for government and third-party support to do that. Whether he can be trusted to take that support, whether he's really changed sides, I think remains a question mark. The statement that he read today in a press conference was clearly written for him. This is a man who typically speaks his own mind, doesn't read from a script. And so I think what we should expect is that the government would spend some time debriefing him and trying to understand what his real motives are, apart from survival.
Got Bryden there for us. Now, in northeastern Nigeria, at least 27 people were killed on Tuesday in multiple suicide bombings. It all happened around Maiduguri. Dozens were hurt after a woman detonated a device in the village of Kondugo. Another pair of attackers struck at the gates of a nearby refugee camp. Now, the death toll from Sierra Leone's fatal mudslides has risen, as the country's chief coroner on Tuesday said that around 400 bodies had been recovered by rescue workers. Sunday night's disasters devastated Freetown. Meanwhile, the difficult search for and care of survivors continues.
It's one of the worst natural disasters in Africa in recent years. Several hundred people have died and the government says thousands are still missing. A hill partially collapsed after 3 days of torrential rain. The mudslide and massive flooding devastated Freetown, one of the world's wettest urban areas, and destroyed families.
I saw the body of my sister. I called for help. We laid her down on the ground. I heard so many people crying. I lost all of my family.
Many makeshift settlements were swept away. The government said some illegal buildings had been erected in the area. Sierra Leone's president said the country now needed urgent help. He also thanked rescue workers.
In collaboration with our development partners, We have already established an emergency response center at Regent to coordinate our response and to provide relief to the survivors.
There are now fears that contaminated water could lead to deadly diseases like cholera. In 2014, Sierra Leone was hit by the Ebola virus that killed more than 4,000 people in the country.
Well, Zimbabwe's First Lady's been accused of beating up a model in a hotel room in Johannesburg. Grace Mugabe had been expected to turn herself in to police in South Africa to face assault charges on Tuesday, but instead she did not make an appearance and turned up back in her homeland later that day. Mugabe's been touted as a possible successor as president to her husband, Robert Mugabe. Robow has not yet commented on the accusations from the alleged victim. Now, she's 20-year-old Gabriella Engels. Our Jane Flanagan's spoken to her about what she says happened. Jane, what did Engels have to say?
Well, Georgia, she gave a graphic account of how she was sitting in a hotel room with a couple of friends when Grace Mugabe burst in on Sunday night and set about the girls with an electrical extension cable and a heavy plug and beat Engels black and blue, and Engels is now sporting 14 stitches to her forehead and many more stitches to her scalp. And she described to me how she'd cowered at the feet of Zimbabwe's First Lady, begging for mercy. And she thought at some point that she was going to fall unconscious or even die because of the ferocity of the attack, which was witnessed by around a dozen bodyguards and security guards who all loyal to Grace Mugabe, who watched on. Engels reported the matter to police the following day, and I understand after speaking to the police that Grace Mugabe's lawyers did get in touch with the police and agreed that the First Lady would present herself for questioning. But as you mentioned, she wasn't seen today in South Africa after all.
So it's not the first time Grace Mugabe has actually faced accusations like this. Now that she's back in Zimbabwe, is she likely to be treated as a fugitive by South Africa?
Well, South African police would only say that the investigation is continuing, and then a decision will be made whether to issue a warrant for her arrest or not. Intriguingly, Robert Mugabe is due back in South Africa later on this week for a state event, and it'll be interesting to see whether he is accompanied by his second wife, Grace Mugabe, and whether or not any further action is taken against her.
Thanks very much. Jane Flanagan there for us in Cape Town. Now, no one's yet claimed responsibility for the terror attack in Ouagadougou, in which 18 people were killed by gunmen earlier this week. Our correspondents have spoken to some of those touched by the violence who are still struggling to come to terms with their loss.
This family was devastated by the attack on Sunday evening in a restaurant in Burkina Faso's capital. Sayouba is grief-stricken. He lost his wife.
I have nothing to say. I have nothing to say.
His brother, seen here, has no news of his son, who has gone missing since Sunday. That evening, his sister-in-law, Nana Victorine, who was 24, had come to the restaurant with many children to celebrate her birthday. Confronted by the two attackers, she managed to save her child.
Just before she was killed, she called her husband to say there was an attack and that they needed help. She was holding her one-year-old child. She managed to lay him down safely just before she was gunned down.
Sunday's dramatic event has stunned the nation, just 18 months after another attack on a cafe in the same street that left 30 people dead.
Well, in Algeria, a familiar face has been called in to take up the post of premier after the previous occupant of the post was removed after just 3 months. Ahmed Ouyahia, who served 3 terms already as prime minister since the 1990s, is back in the job. This after Abdelmajid Tebboune was dismissed on Tuesday by President Abdelaziz Bouteflika. And finally, to the biggest church in the world. The Basilica of Our Lady of Peace was the vanity project of Ivory Coast's first president. But despite hundreds of millions of dollars lavished on the monument and its huge capacity, it seldom draws the crowds it's capable of holding. But at times of particular religious significance to Catholics, there is a swell in the numbers, and our correspondents were there for the Assumption service on the 15th of August.
It's the middle of the night and 3,000 pilgrims have come to celebrate the Assumption. Though Yamoussoukro's Basilica of Our Lady of Peace could easily hold 6 times that number, this crowd is the biggest the church has seen all year. Nevertheless, all the stops were pulled out earlier in the day to prepare the 130-hectare estate and its scenic grounds for visitors. Since its consecration by the Pope in 1990, the annual Feast of St. Mary is one of the few to attract large congregations to the world's largest church.
It's a place that's big, beautiful, there's a lot of emotion. You have to come and see it at least once in your life.
For most of the year, the majority of the 7,000 seats remain empty during services, but during Catholic festivals, the numbers swell as pilgrims come from all around the region. Commissioned by Ivory Coast's first president, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, and constructed between 1985 and 1989, the extravagant domed complex stretches across 99,000 metres and soars 160 metres into the air. As the service gets underway, there's no lack of ambiance.
Dear brothers and sisters, welcome to the Basilica of Our Lady of Peace.
The church is also a draw for tourists, many who've come to get a closer look at the craftsmanship of the 36 massive stained glass windows handmade in France and the crystal chandelier hanging above the altar.
It is true that the Basilica comes alive again. When it's full, it's majestic, and for the Ivorians it generates a lot of pride to have this sanctuary erected to the glory of God. It's part of our identity as Ivorians.
Despite the rain and cold, at nightfall, worshippers gather for a torchlit vigil.
A basilica in Africa. It attracts the curious. Everyone wants to know a little more about it. Everyone wants to see it.
After the feast day celebrations draw to a close in the early morning, the visitors begin to make their way home. And the basilica is once more left monumentally grand but vastly empty, until the next festival brings in a sizable congregation.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks very much for joining us. Do so again. Take care.